Edit do as I say or quit. The CEO snapped. The single dad walked out, leaving everyone stunned. What could make a single decision leave everyone stunned? Why would those few words change everything that followed? Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're so glad you're here to spend a little time with us. If you enjoy heartfelt stories about dignity, second chances, and unforgettable moments, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Thank you for watching, for your support, and for being part of this amazing community. Before we begin, tell us where in the world you're watching from, and what time is it where you are right now. Now, settle in, because our story begins with a moment that no one in the room expected to witness. Do as I say or quit. The words landed with the sharp certainty of a judge's gavel, cutting through the silence of the executive boardroom and leaving every pair of eyes frozen on the man standing at the far end of the polished walnut table. Nobody expected Ethan Walker to answer. Nobody expected him to move. For 8 years, he had been the quiet force behind Ashford Dynamics, the kind of employee whose name rarely appeared in company newsletters, but somehow appeared whenever impossible deadlines became possible victories. He wasn't the loudest voice, the highest-paid executive, or the person who demanded attention. He simply showed up before sunrise, solved problems no one else noticed, and disappeared home every evening to the little girl waiting for him with homework spread across the kitchen table. Victoria Hayes, the company's newly appointed CEO, folded her arms as sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Chicago. At 36, she had built a reputation for decisive leadership, fearless restructuring, and an intolerance for hesitation. Investors admired her confidence. Business magazines celebrated her bold vision. Employees, however, were still learning that every meeting with Victoria felt less like a conversation and more like an examination. Around the conference table, department heads exchanged nervous glances without daring to speak. Coffee cups sat untouched. Laptop screens glowed quietly. Even the air conditioning seemed louder than usual. Ethan looked at Victoria with calm eyes that revealed neither anger nor fear. There was no challenge in his expression, no desperate attempt to defend himself, only the quiet composure of someone who had already made peace with whatever came next. Victoria waited, expecting resistance, an apology, perhaps an argument. Instead, Ethan reached slowly into his jacket pocket and removed the company badge he had carried every workday for nearly a decade. The small plastic card caught the morning light as he placed it gently on the conference table. The sound it made was almost impossibly soft, yet it echoed across the room like thunder. "Then today is my last day," he said. His voice was steady, respectful, and surprisingly warm. No bitterness, no accusation, just a simple statement that somehow carried more weight than any raised voice ever could. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The vice president of finance lowered his pen. The human resources director stared in disbelief. Someone near the back quietly whispered, "Is he serious?" Ethan offered a polite nod to the room, picked up the worn leather notebook he had carried to hundreds of meetings, and walked toward the door without looking back. His footsteps were unhurried, measured, almost peaceful. The door closed behind him with a gentle click, and only then did people seem to remember how to breathe. Victoria remained standing, her confident posture unchanged, though something unfamiliar flickered behind her composed expression. She believed she had just enforced discipline. She had no idea she had also set something much larger into motion. Outside the conference room, Ethan paused for only a moment beside the hallway window overlooking the busy streets below. He slipped his phone from his pocket and smiled at the lock screen. A photo of his 8-year-old daughter grinning beside a homemade birthday cake covered in uneven frosting. "I'll be home early today, Lily," he whispered to himself before walking toward the elevator, leaving behind a silence that would soon become impossible for the entire company to ignore. Ethan Walker stepped out into the crisp Chicago morning with nothing in his hands except the worn leather notebook, his phone, and the quiet certainty that some decisions could not be undone once dignity had been placed on the line. The revolving doors of Ashford Dynamics spun behind him as employees hurried inside carrying coffee cups, laptop bags, and the ordinary worries of another workday. None of them realized that the man walking toward the parking garage had solved problems they would never even know existed. Ethan climbed into his 12-year-old pickup truck and rested both hands on the steering wheel without starting the engine. His phone vibrated softly. A message appeared from Lily. "Do not forget today is family reading day." A small smile crossed his face. "I will be there," he typed back. "I promised." Promises mattered to Ethan because they had become the foundation of a life rebuilt one careful day at a time. 5 years earlier, after losing his wife to a long illness, he had discovered that grief did not disappear. It simply learned to sit quietly beside hope. Since then, every morning began at 5:30. He prepared breakfast, packed Lily's lunch, braided her light blonde hair the best he could after watching countless online tutorials, and drove her to Lincoln Elementary before heading downtown. His coworkers assumed he arrived early because he was ambitious. The truth was much simpler. Arriving early meant leaving on time, and leaving on time meant keeping another promise to the little girl waiting at home. Inside Ashford Dynamics, Ethan had never chased titles or recognition. He remembered the names of security guards, celebrated birthdays for interns, and quietly repaired mistakes before they became disasters. When a new employee struggled, Ethan stayed after hours to explain complicated systems without making anyone feel embarrassed. When storms knocked out power across part of the city one winter, he slept on a folding chair in the operations center to keep critical services running for clients across the country. Nobody asked him to do it. He simply believed responsibility belonged to whoever was willing to carry it. That quiet consistency earned him something far more valuable than applause. It earned trust. People from every department found themselves stopping by his office. Some came with technical questions. Others came because they needed someone who listened before speaking. Ethan rarely offered dramatic advice. He asked thoughtful questions, smiled gently, and somehow people always left feeling lighter than when they arrived. Yet when Victoria Hayes accepted the position as Chief Executive Officer 3 months earlier, she inherited spreadsheets, reports, and organizational charts rather than stories. She saw performance metrics, profit margins, and efficiency forecasts. She did not see the invisible relationships that held the company together. During her first leadership meeting, she had announced that emotional attachment to old systems was the enemy of innovation. Several executives nodded enthusiastically. Ethan simply wrote notes in his notebook. He respected leadership enough to give it time before offering opinions. As the weeks passed, policies changed almost daily. Layers of approval replaced practical judgment. Experienced managers became hesitant to make decisions without permission. The pace of the company slowed in subtle ways that only someone deeply familiar with its rhythm could recognize. Ethan privately documented every concern with facts instead of emotions, hoping there would eventually be a conversation built on solutions rather than pride. He never imagined that conversation would end with his resignation. As he finally started the truck and pulled away from the building, the morning sun reflected off the glass tower behind him. From the outside, Ashford Dynamics looked stronger than ever, standing tall against the Chicago skyline. But appearances had a way of hiding the smallest cracks, and Ethan knew from years of experience that the quietest fractures often became the ones that changed everything. The conference room remained unusually quiet long after Ethan Walker had left. Nobody rushed to speak because everyone was waiting for someone else to break the silence first. Victoria Hayes gathered the printed reports from the table with practiced confidence, refusing to let the unexpected resignation change the direction of the meeting. She looked around the room, her expression calm and composed. "We are moving forward exactly as planned," she said. "Our success will never depend on one individual." A few executives nodded immediately. Others forced polite smiles. Only Richard Coleman, the company's 63-year-old chief financial officer, remained thoughtful as he slowly closed his notebook. He had worked at Ashford Dynamics for nearly 3 decades, long enough to understand that the most important people inside an organization were often the least visible. Victoria walked toward the large digital display mounted on the wall and outlined the next phase of her restructuring plan. Every department would now report directly through newly created approval channels. Independent decision-making would be reduced. Every operational change required executive authorization. Every client request would follow standardized procedures without exception. The presentation looked flawless. Charts climbed upward. Forecasts projected stronger profit margins. The strategy impressed investors during quarterly briefings. Yet inside the room, Several department leaders quietly exchanged uncertain glances. Melissa Grant, Director of Customer Success, raised her hand carefully. What happens if a client needs an immediate solution outside the new approval process? Victoria answered without hesitation. Then they wait for approval. Consistency creates excellence. Melissa nodded respectfully, although she remembered dozens of situations where Ethan had solved emergencies within minutes because he trusted experienced managers to act without unnecessary delay. Richard finally spoke. His voice remained gentle, carrying the calm authority earned through years rather than titles. Victoria, Ethan understood operational relationships that never appeared on organizational charts. Victoria offered a professional smile. Every process can be documented, Richard. Knowledge belongs to the company, not to one employee. Richard considered responding, but chose silence instead. Experience had taught him that wisdom often needed time to be heard. Outside the executive floor, rumors spread quietly through the building. Employees gathered near coffee machines speaking in lowered voices. Some refused to believe Ethan had actually resigned. Others assumed he would return after the weekend once emotions settled. A young analyst stared at the empty office where Ethan usually worked with the door open. The desk looked strangely untouched. No framed awards. No expensive decorations. Only a small desk plant, neatly organized folders, and a handwritten thank you card from an intern who had once struggled during her first month. She read the card through the glass door and smiled sadly. Thank you for believing in me before I believed in myself. By late afternoon, Victoria instructed the facilities department to prepare Ethan's office for his replacement. She believed symbols mattered. Empty offices reminded people of departures instead of opportunities. As maintenance workers carefully packed books into storage boxes, one discovered several thick binders labeled only by year. Assuming they contained outdated records, he carried them toward the archive room. Nobody noticed that Ethan had taken almost nothing with him because almost everything valuable already existed inside his memory. Hundreds of procedures, supplier relationships, emergency solutions, and unwritten agreements had never required paper. They had been built through years of quiet conversations, patient listening, and trust earned one promise at a time. As evening settled over Chicago, lights continued glowing inside Ashford Dynamics long after most neighboring buildings had emptied. The company appeared busy, productive, and completely under control. Yet beneath that polished confidence, something subtle had already begun to shift. Like the first unnoticed movement beneath the surface of a frozen lake, the change was silent, almost invisible, and impossible to stop once it had begun. The next morning began with confidence inside the executive offices and quiet routine everywhere else. Victoria Hayes arrived precisely at 7:30, accepted greetings with a brief smile, and walked directly into her office carrying a fresh stack of strategic reports. She believed yesterday had marked the beginning of a stronger company, one built on structure instead of personalities. Across the operations floor, however, the rhythm felt different in ways that no spreadsheet could measure. Melissa Grant reached her desk to find 12 urgent emails from clients asking for decisions that normally would have taken Ethan less than 15 minutes to resolve. Following the new policy, she forwarded each request through the required approval chain. One approval became 3. 3 became 6. Minutes quietly turned into hours. Nobody complained openly, but everyone noticed the growing delays. At 9 o'clock, the customer support manager stepped into the office of the new operations supervisor, Daniel Brooks, a capable manager promoted only the evening before. He looked at the dashboard covering 3 computer monitors and frowned. These escalation codes keep appearing. Ethan usually knew exactly which departments needed to coordinate first. Daniel searched through digital manuals and standardized procedures. Every instruction seemed complete until a situation required practical judgment instead of written rules. There has to be a document somewhere, he murmured. The support manager answered softly, I hope so. On the executive floor, Victoria chaired another leadership meeting with the same steady confidence she had shown the previous day. Quarterly projections remained positive. Investors had already praised her restructuring announcement. Everything looked encouraging until Melissa entered carrying a folder she had not intended to bring. I apologize for interrupting, she said carefully, but our response time for priority clients has doubled since yesterday afternoon. Victoria barely glanced at the numbers before replying. Temporary adjustments are normal during organizational change. Stay focused on the process. Melissa nodded respectfully, although the concern in her eyes remained. Shortly afterward, Richard Coleman quietly visited the archive room looking for financial records. As he passed several storage shelves, he noticed the binders removed from Ethan's office. Curious, he opened one. Instead of routine reports, he found handwritten notes documenting years of operational improvements, emergency contact lists, supplier preferences, seasonal risk patterns, and observations that no software system had ever captured. Each page reflected careful thought, patience, and an understanding that businesses were built as much on people as on procedures. Richard slowly closed the binder and sighed. None of this knowledge had been requested during leadership transitions because nobody had realized how much lived beyond official documentation. At the same time, Ethan parked outside Lincoln Elementary carrying a paper bag filled with homemade chocolate chip cookies that Lily had insisted they bake together the night before. Parents smiled as children hurried toward classrooms, wearing colorful backpacks almost as large as they were. Lily spotted her father across the hallway and ran into his arms with joyful excitement. "You came," she whispered. Ethan laughed softly. "I always keep my promises." Together, they spent the morning reading stories to second graders who listened with wide eyes and endless curiosity. For the first time in years, Ethan experienced an ordinary weekday, without checking work emails every few minutes. The peace felt unfamiliar but welcome. Back downtown, another client requested an immediate exception that required someone who understood both company policy and years of practical relationships. The request sat untouched inside the approval system while notifications quietly multiplied across department screens. Nobody realized that these were not isolated inconveniences. They were the first small pieces of a much larger pattern, one that would soon reveal the true cost of replacing quiet wisdom with unquestioned authority. By Thursday morning, the confidence that had filled Ashford Dynamics only 2 days earlier had begun to fade beneath an uncomfortable layer of uncertainty. The problems were still small enough to explain away, yet they appeared with growing frequency, like tiny cracks spreading across a windshield after a single unnoticed impact. A nationwide retail client called twice before 8 o'clock asking why an urgent logistics adjustment had not been approved. A hospital network requested an immediate system modification before the afternoon deadline. A manufacturing partner needed authorization to reroute shipments ahead of an approaching storm in the Midwest. Each request entered the new approval process exactly as designed. Each request waited. Daniel Brooks stared at the growing queue on his monitor and rubbed his forehead. Every solution required information that was never written into the official procedures. The documents explained what should happen. They never explained why Ethan had often chosen a different path when real people, real customers, and real deadlines collided. Melissa Grant quietly walked into Daniel's office carrying another stack of printed requests. 3 clients asked for Ethan by name this morning, she said. Daniel lowered his eyes. "What did you tell them?" Melissa hesitated before answering. "I said he no longer works here." Neither of them spoke again for several moments. The silence carried more weight than any complaint could have. Upstairs, Victoria Hayes was meeting with members of the board through a video conference. She confidently described the progress of the restructuring initiative, highlighting lower administrative costs and stronger executive oversight. The presentation was polished, precise, and supported by attractive charts that still reflected last month's success. Halfway through the meeting, her assistant quietly entered the office and placed a handwritten note beside her laptop. Priority client requesting immediate executive response. Victoria glanced at it, finished answering the board's questions, and continued speaking without interruption. Discipline always produces short-term discomfort before long-term excellence, she explained. The board members appeared satisfied. They had not yet seen what was happening beneath the numbers. Meanwhile, Richard Coleman remained inside the archive room, reviewing more of Ethan's handwritten binders. Every page revealed another invisible responsibility Ethan had quietly accepted without ever requesting recognition. Holiday staffing plans included notes about employees caring for elderly parents. Supplier contacts contained reminders about family-owned businesses that needed extra flexibility during harsh winters. Emergency response guides included personal cell phone numbers, birthdays, preferred communication styles, and simple observations such as, always call before sending difficult news. People deserve respect before paperwork. Richard slowly removed his reading glasses and leaned back in his chair. Ethan had never managed operations through systems alone. He had managed them through trust. At exactly 3:15 that afternoon, a notification appeared across several executive dashboards. One of the company's largest national clients had requested a personal meeting with the chief executive officer the following morning after expressing serious concerns about declining response times. Victoria read the message twice before setting her tablet on the desk. Her confident expression remained unchanged, but for the first time since becoming chief executive officer, she canceled the remainder of her afternoon appointments. Down the street, Ethan was sitting on a wooden bench outside a neighborhood park while Lily laughed with friends on the playground. The summer breeze carried the sound of children chasing one another across the grass, and for a brief moment the world felt wonderfully uncomplicated. Ethan watched his daughter smile beneath the bright afternoon sun and realized he could not remember the last weekday he had been able to do the same. His phone remained silent inside his pocket. He had deleted every company email application before leaving the building. Whatever happened now no longer belonged to him. Yet only a few miles away, the company he had quietly protected for years was beginning to discover that the greatest strength inside any organization was not found in policies or titles, but in the character of the people who chose every day to carry responsibilities that no one else even knew existed. Friday morning arrived beneath a gray Chicago sky, and for the first time since Victoria Hayes had taken control of Ashford Dynamics, uncertainty entered the executive floor before she did. Her assistant met her at the elevator with an expression that needed no explanation. "The Northbridge retail meeting has been moved up to 8:30, she said quietly. They requested every department head attend. Victoria nodded once and continued walking. Confidence was still visible in her posture, but it no longer came as effortlessly as before. Inside the boardroom, representatives from Northbridge Retail appeared on the large conference screen. Their senior vice president, Michael Turner, spoke politely, yet every word carried the weight of disappointment. "For 6 years, your company solved our problems before they became emergencies. This week, our requests have waited hours instead of minutes. We are not questioning your technology. We are questioning what changed." Victoria answered with practiced professionalism. "We are implementing a company-wide operational improvement plan. Temporary adjustments are expected during any transition." Michael paused before asking a simple question. "Where is Ethan Walker?" The room became silent again. Melissa lowered her eyes. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Richard Coleman quietly folded his hands together. Victoria answered without emotion. "Mr. Walker is no longer employed by the company." Michael leaned back slowly. "That explains more than you probably realize." Before anyone could respond, another executive on the client side spoke. "Whenever something unexpected happened, Ethan already understood our business before we finished explaining the situation. We trusted your company because we trusted him." The call ended respectfully, but not comfortably. There were no raised voices, no dramatic accusations, only a calm warning that Northbridge would begin reviewing alternative vendors if service levels did not improve immediately. As the conference screen turned black, nobody moved. Victoria finally looked toward Daniel. "Tell me exactly what is happening." Daniel took a careful breath. "I have followed every documented procedure exactly as written. The problem is that many critical decisions were never fully documented because Ethan handled them through experience and long-term relationships." Victoria turned toward Richard, expecting disagreement. Instead, he quietly stood and walked to the cabinet beside the wall. He placed one of Ethan's handwritten binders on the conference table and opened it to the first page. Every margin contained notes, reminders, names, and observations gathered over years. Richard gently slid the binder toward Victoria. "This is only one volume," he said. "There are 11 more." Victoria slowly turned the pages. There were no personal achievements recorded, no requests for recognition, only practical wisdom offered without expectation. Beside one supplier's name Ethan had written, "Call his daughter first on Mondays because he volunteers at the Veterans Center until noon." Next to another client he had added, "Never schedule system updates during local school fundraisers because half their staff volunteers after lunch." Another page simply read, "Good decisions begin with understanding people." Victoria looked up, genuinely surprised. Why was none of this included in our transition reports? Richard answered with a sad smile. Because nobody asked him how he accomplished impossible things. They only measured the results after he quietly delivered them. The realization settled over the room with remarkable stillness. Ethan had not merely managed operations. He had become the invisible bridge connecting people, trust, and responsibility. The systems still existed. The software still functioned. The organizational charts remained unchanged. But the human understanding that held everything together had walked out of the building carrying nothing except a leather notebook and his dignity. For the first time since becoming chief executive officer, Victoria Hayes understood that she had not lost an employee. She had underestimated the quiet man who had been holding an entire company together without ever asking anyone to notice. That afternoon, after the last executive meeting ended without a solution, Victoria Hayes did something none of her leadership team expected. She canceled every remaining appointment, picked up the folded sheet of paper containing Ethan Walker's home address from his personnel file, and drove away from the downtown skyline. Without notifying anyone where she was going, the glass towers slowly disappeared in her rearview mirror, replaced by quiet neighborhoods lined with maple trees, bicycles resting on front lawns, and children drawing colorful chalk pictures across sidewalks. It had been years since Victoria had driven through a neighborhood without thinking about market values or development opportunities. Today, for the first time, she simply looked. Ethan lived in a modest two-story house with white siding, blue shutters, and a small front porch decorated with flower pots that had clearly been cared for with patience rather than money. A faded basketball leaned against the garage beside a pink scooter that looked well-loved after years of use. Victoria parked across the street and remained inside her car for several moments, uncertain why walking the final few steps suddenly felt more difficult than standing before an entire board of directors. Before she could gather her thoughts, laughter drifted through an open backyard gate. She quietly stepped onto the sidewalk and looked through the fence. Ethan was kneeling beside a small wooden table while Lily carefully painted a birdhouse bright yellow. Streaks of blue paint covered both of their hands. "I think the bird will like this color," Lily said proudly. Ethan smiled warmly. "I think the bird will feel welcome because you made it with love." She laughed and accidentally brushed yellow paint across the sleeve of his old flannel shirt. Instead of being annoyed, Ethan laughed with her until they both forgot about the paint entirely. Victoria watched silently, surprised by how ordinary everything appeared. There were no signs of hidden wealth, no expensive cars, no luxurious home office waiting for a secret executive opportunity. There was only a father whose greatest investment seemed to be time spent with his daughter. Ethan eventually noticed someone standing near the gate. He looked up, recognized Victoria immediately, and walked over with the same calm expression he had carried out of the conference room days earlier. He opened the gate politely. "Good afternoon," he said. "Would you like to come in?" There was no resentment in his voice, no sarcasm, no attempt to make her uncomfortable. That simple kindness unsettled Victoria more than anger ever could have. "I hope I am not interrupting," she replied quietly. Ethan glanced toward Lily, who remained happily focused on her painting. "You are visiting during birdhouse construction," he said with a gentle smile. "That is usually a forgiving schedule." Victoria almost smiled back before remembering why she had come. She looked around the backyard, noticing a small vegetable garden, a weathered picnic table, and wind chimes moving softly in the afternoon breeze. Everything reflected care rather than luxury. "I thought," she began before stopping herself. Ethan waited patiently. "I thought your life would look different," she admitted. Ethan followed her gaze toward Lily. "It does," he answered softly. "Different from what most people imagine." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were birds singing from nearby trees and Lily humming quietly while adding another careful brushstroke to the tiny wooden roof. Victoria suddenly understood something that had never appeared on any performance review. Every evening Ethan had left the office exactly on time, not because he lacked ambition, but because someone far more important than any corporate title had been waiting for him to come home. Standing in that peaceful backyard, surrounded by simple moments money could never purchase, Victoria began to realize that the quiet man she had judged so quickly had already built the kind of success that could never be measured inside a quarterly report. Victoria Hayes stood quietly beside the weathered picnic table while the afternoon breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass through Ethan Walker's backyard. For a moment, neither of them felt the need to fill the silence with unnecessary words. Lily carefully placed the finished birdhouse on the table and smiled proudly. "Daddy says birds always come back when they know they are welcome," she said. Victoria looked at the little wooden house, painted in bright yellow with uneven blue flowers across the sides, and something about its simple beauty made the polished conference. Rooms downtown seemed strangely empty. Ethan knelt beside his daughter. "Why do not you wash the paintbrushes while I talk with our guest?" Lily nodded happily and disappeared into the house, humming the same cheerful tune she had sung all afternoon. Victoria finally gathered the courage to speak. "I owe you an apology." Ethan listened without interrupting. "I judged your value by what I could measure," she continued quietly. "I believed leadership meant having all the answers before asking the right questions." Ethan folded his hands together. "Leading people is different from managing numbers," he replied gently. "Numbers tell you what happened. People tell you why." Before Victoria could respond, her phone began vibrating repeatedly. She glanced at the screen and saw 6 missed calls from Daniel Brooks, followed by 3 urgent messages from Richard Coleman. She answered immediately. Daniel's normally calm voice carried unmistakable concern. "Victoria, Northbridge Retail has suspended next week's expansion project. They said they cannot move forward until we restore the service standards they trusted. If we lose this account, several other national clients may follow." Victoria closed her eyes for a brief moment. "I will be there as soon as I can." She ended the call and looked back at Ethan. "The situation is becoming worse much faster than we expected." Ethan nodded thoughtfully, almost as though he had anticipated the news. "Northbridge has always valued consistency more than speed," he said. "If they believe trust has been damaged, they will protect their own customers first." Victoria stared at him in surprise. "How did you know that without hearing the conversation?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Because I listened to them for 6 years." Another quiet silence settled between them. Finally, Victoria took a slow breath. "Would you consider coming back to help us?" Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the kitchen window where Lily was drying paintbrushes with careful concentration. "If I returned because my pride wanted to prove something, I would teach my daughter the wrong lesson," he said softly. "And if I stayed away because my pride was hurt, I would teach her the same lesson in a different way." Victoria lowered her eyes. "Then what matters most?" Ethan answered without hesitation. "The people who had nothing to do with our disagreement. Customer service representatives, warehouse teams, young employees paying mortgages, families depending on every paycheck. They should never suffer because 2 leaders failed to understand each other." Victoria felt every word settle deeply inside her heart. She had spent years believing strength meant refusing to change direction once a decision had been made. Yet standing before a man she had publicly dismissed, she was witnessing a far greater kind of strength, one that chose responsibility over resentment and grace over personal victory. Ethan looked once more toward his daughter before turning back to Victoria. "I will help save the company," he said calmly. "But I am not doing it for titles, promotions, or recognition. I am doing it because good people deserve another chance, even when their leaders have made mistakes." For the first time since this difficult journey had begun, Victoria realized that redemption was not something a person demanded. It was something quietly offered by those whose character remained stronger than their pride. The following Monday morning, employees gathered inside the main auditorium at Ashford Dynamics with an uneasy curiosity that spread from one conversation to the next. Nobody knew exactly why an all-company meeting had been called with such little notice, but everyone sensed that the past few days had changed something far beyond quarterly reports or executive decisions. Victoria Hayes stepped onto the stage first. She looked exactly as professional as she always had, yet there was a new humility in the way she paused before speaking. She looked across hundreds of familiar faces and took a slow breath. "Today," she began, "I am not here to announce another restructuring plan. I am here to acknowledge a mistake." The room became completely silent. "When I became chief executive officer, I believed strong leadership meant always having the right answer. I measured performance through reports, procedures, and efficiency. In doing so, I failed to recognize something far more valuable. Character cannot always be measured. Trust cannot be replaced by policy, and quiet leadership often carries the greatest responsibility. She turned toward the side of the stage where Ethan Walker stood waiting with the same calm expression that had never changed. He walked forward without seeking attention, dressed in the same simple navy blazer he had worn for years. There was no triumph in his face, no satisfaction in proving anyone wrong. Victoria looked directly at him before addressing the company once more. I publicly failed to show respect to someone who spent years serving this organization with extraordinary integrity. For that, I offer my sincere apology. Every employee watched as Ethan nodded gently. Thank you, he replied. Apology accepted. There were no dramatic speeches, no lingering resentment. Only two simple sentences that somehow carried enough grace to quiet an entire room. Victoria then held out a folder containing an official offer. I would like to invite Ethan Walker to return as Executive Director of Operations with full authority to rebuild the systems that have always served this company so well. Ethan accepted the folder, looked at it briefly, then closed it without opening the first page. Several employees exchanged puzzled glances. I am grateful for your confidence, he said warmly, but I will not be returning to my previous position. A wave of surprise moved through the audience. Before disappointment could settle in, Ethan continued, I will gladly serve as a senior advisor during this transition, helping every department regain its strength and sharing everything I have learned over the years. But leadership should never depend on one person. My goal is to help build a team where wisdom is shared, trust is multiplied, and every employee feels respected. Richard Coleman smiled quietly from the front row. Melissa lowered her eyes as tears of relief filled them. Even Daniel Brooks straightened his shoulders with renewed confidence because he understood that he would be learning beside the very man he had unintentionally replaced. Victoria nodded, with genuine appreciation. Then, that is exactly how we will move forward. Over the following months, Ashford Dynamics recovered steadily. Client relationships grew stronger than before because they were rebuilt through honesty instead of pride. Employees discovered that open conversations solved problems faster than rigid authority. Victoria became known not only as an intelligent executive, but also as a leader willing to listen before deciding. Ethan spent more afternoons at home helping Lily with science projects, attending school events, and keeping every promise that mattered most. Sometimes the greatest victory is not returning to the place where you were underestimated. Sometimes it is leaving behind enough dignity to inspire others to become better than they were before. And in the quiet moments that followed, everyone who had witnessed that remarkable journey finally understood a truth that no title could ever guarantee. Respect is never commanded. It is earned through grace, humility, and the quiet courage to choose people before power.